vinyl community, this is Tommy and welcome to another musical adventure. And today we're going to be talking about something that's kind of special to me, and I'm going to share a couple of stories and maybe get some of your thoughts about these two bands. And of course, by the title you can tell it is the Beatles versus the Beach Boys. Now, before your heads explode, I think there's no doubt in our minds that the Beatles are probably the superior group. And in most people's minds, that's probably true. So I'm not trying to necessarily get a feel for anyone that's better or anything like that. I just want to kind of compare the career trajectory of both bands and talk about where things kind of split. Now, first off, I guess a little background. I was born in 1975. I'll be 45 years old this year. And so I wasn't around during the time of either of these bands in their primes, so to speak. Now, some would argue, and even me would argue, that the Beach Boys probably hit their prime later on. And but you know, when the bands first appeared on the scene. And so having said that, you know, I can only kind of judge these bands by their works in history and retrospect and kind of how they shape up. Now, growing up in the 80s, I was very aware of the Beach Boys. Good Vibrations was the song used in the Sunkissed ads, the Sunkissed orange soda drink. But the image I had of the Beach Boys was a surfing band. They were into surfing and into the beach. And of course, cars were a big part of the Beach Boys, and girls, surfing, cars, and girls. Those were the big three things that I kind of always associated with the Beach Boys. And this is an image that I believe that was kind of perpetuated by Mike Love in particular. I think that as the band got into the 80s and kept moving forward, I think he was kind of stuck in that sort of early 60s mindset that's where they were. Now, I was completely unaware of Brian Wilson and the whole dynamic of how they worked. But when I was about 14 years old, kind of going into high school, I discovered the Beatles. And those of you that watch my channel know that this is how I discovered the Beatles. I was listening to the Blue Album. Now, I say discovered the Beatles. I had heard the Beatles also growing up, and I was very aware of who they were. But this is the album, 1967 through 70. The Blue Album was the album that really kind of made me sort of open my eyes to the Beatles and how great they were. This is a compilation. It covers that latter part of their career. It begins with Strawberry Fields Forever and works its way through the Let It Be material, The Long and Winding Road and whatnot. But you know, I really soaked this music in when I heard it for the first time. It's like my eyes were open. I sometimes tell people my world went from black and white to color, and it was because of the Beatles. Now, at that time, being a naive and rather foolish young man, I kind of dismissed all the early Beatles stuff as nothing more than, you know, teeny bopper fare. So She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand. I knew that stuff, but I didn't think, oh, it could be taken that seriously, especially not as seriously as this stuff. Now, as I was sort of discovering the Beatles and learning about the Beatles and really focusing on those later years, 1992 saw the 25th anniversary of the release of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, a landmark album, an album that deserves all the accolades that it receives, and a lot of people's favorite Beatles album, and I can certainly understand why. And so I'm not going to argue with that. But in 1992, there was a special that came on the Disney Channel called The Making of Sgt. Pepper. Now, those of you who purchased the Super Deluxe box set that came out about 3 years ago, the reissue of Sgt. Pepper, on the Blu-ray, that special was on there. I recorded it on VHS tape as it came on the Disney Channel, and I watched it several times. Now, those of you who have seen the special knows that this features George Martin, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, Ringo Starr. They talk about, you know, how the album was made, and they go through these different songs and kind of show the making of. Now, this is before the anthologies. This is before we had classic albums and those kinds of things. You know, that's kind of in abundance now. This was kind of unique. It was one of a kind. But somewhere in that video or in that special, Paul McCartney talks about the big influence on Sgt. Pepper was the Beach Boys, Brian Wilson, and in particular, Pet Sounds. Now, in my young, dumb brain, I actually thought that was laughable because in my mind, the Beach Boys were about surfing, cars, and girls, and there was no depth whatsoever to that material. So, how could a daft band like the Beach Boys influence the great and mighty, powerful Beatles? And then the special cuts to Brian Wilson, who's talking about how he made Pet Sounds. And I didn't know anything about Brian Wilson. I thought it was absolutely ludicrous. Like Paul McCartney, the great writer, the great composer, is giving props to this goofy guy. Um, I was so, it was so beneath me, and I almost thought it was kind of a joke. But as I got older and discovered music and began to appreciate more music, and then of course discovering the music of the Beach Boys and the brilliance of Pet Sounds, I really started to open my eyes, as it were, as to how that happened. Now, the story always goes with talking about Pet Sounds is that Brian heard Rubber Soul by the Beatles. Now, this is the Capitol release of Rubber Soul, the American release. And there's some debate on which version of Rubber Soul Brian heard. He said in an interview, and I think rather recently, that it was the British version of the album. I really think it probably was the American album. He talked about how it was a folk album and how all the songs kind of flowed together. And British Rubber Soul and American Rubber Soul are different, but I want to say that this is probably the one he heard. Either way, it spurred him on to get creative in the studio and start working on Pet Sounds and really expanding the Beach Boys musical universe. Now, one of the things with the Beach Boys that I always found interesting, and especially as I studied and learned more, is that in my mind, the Beatles sort of represented almost a superpower. James Griffiths on his Beatle James channel, which is really, really good, and any fan of the Beatles and Beatles music definitely needs to go check that channel out and follow what he's doing over there. He recently did a video on 10 things that George Martin gave the Beatles. I think that the four Beatles, John, Paul, George, and Ringo, along with George Martin, kind of formed this five-man super team of brilliance. And the stuff that they did, they wrote, recorded, I think it took all of those personalities working together to produce what they did. And I'm not talking about the stuff where maybe John and Paul dipped away into the studio and made a song or whatever. I think part of the magic of the Beatles are the four personalities of the members of the band with George Martin's influence. I think that's what makes it work. Brian, on the other hand, seemed to be kind of a singular guy. He was writing and producing out, even though he had people like Tony Asher and Van Dyke Parks and these different collaborators. Brian was really the guy that was kind of in charge of making all of it happen and putting it all together. And I think that was an incredible burden, particularly in that time when you were driven by singles and hits and just being present and on the radio and people, following who you were. So what happens is Rubber Soul comes out and it's got Brian working on Pet Sounds. And so Brian is basically entering into this production race with the Beatles. You got the American Beach Boys on one side that's doing this really innovative, crazy stuff. And then you've got the Beatles on the other side that are doing something similar. They'd gone off the road, decided to focus on the studio and making albums. And so they're kind of seeing who can outdo who. Now, somewhere on the tail of Pet Sounds comes the brilliant single of Good Vibrations, which was a completely mind-blowing experience musically, a pocket symphony, as it were. And so a lot of this burgeoning rock and roll press and people that were really writing about rock and roll and taking it seriously are looking at Brian Wilson and sort of looking into the studio and saying, what's he doing? What's he coming up with? And he starts talking about how the follow-up to Pet Sounds and Good Vibrations is going to be even better. And it's called Dumb Angel, or Teenage Symphonies to God, later known as Smile. Now, I want to point out a book. Dominic Priori compiled this. This is called Look, Listen, Vibrate, Smile. Anyone that is even remotely curious about this period in the Beach Boys' history, I highly recommend this book. What it is, it's basically a compilation of what's going on with Brian Wilson and the press and what they're writing about Brian. As you can see on that page, that first page I turned to, the Beatles beaten. That, you know, Brian was in direct competition with the Beatles at this point. And so all eyes are on Brian Wilson, and they want to know what is coming, what he's going to come up with next. And they're all looking at him to try to understand that. This is a fantastic book, and it follows kind of what's going on in the studio during the making of the record and kind of what people were writing about during this time. It's really, really astonishing stuff and really fascinating to listen to. Now, Capitol Records, we're really excited. Good Vibrations was a big hit. Everybody's writing and heaping these praises on Brian Wilson. They even did a cover for the album that was coming out. I believe May of '67 was when it was scheduled to be released. The Beach Boys Smile. There was a lot of hype, and a lot of people were waiting to hear this album. Now, recently, the Smile sessions were released, and there's a lot of stories about the drugs that Brian was consuming and how that really took him out of action. I think, you know, in part, I'm not going to say there was no experimentation going on, but I will say that listening to the session tapes, Brian is very focused and he knows what he wants. And he's very demanding of the musicians in the studio. And I think for somebody that supposedly is whacked out on drugs as people claimed that he was, I find it very hard to believe. Now, I do think that drugs played a large role later on in his life and in his career and sort of, you know, sidelining him. But I think during this period, I think he was just very driven, very creative, and was really, really pushing. Well, the death knell finally came as he was trying to release his masterwork and a follow-up to Pet Sounds. Well, Sgt. Pepper comes out, and that pretty much puts an end to Smile and any movement going forward. Now, Brian had a couple of problems, and I think drugs were the least of them. I think one of the main problems was that the members of the band, his brothers and his cousin, weren't too keen on the material. They thought it was weird, and they were kind of pushing against him like, hey, what are you doing here? This is really strange. I don't know about doing this. Now, that's one of the things I think that happened, and plus the fact that Sgt. Pepper was released, I think it just killed any momentum he felt like he had going forward. And the rest of the story is pretty well chronicled, and I won't go into it here. But I think what the end of it is, and I've wondered and I've had discussions with other music fans, had Smile come out when it was supposed to, had it been completed, would it have been the landmark album that Pepper was? Would it have supplanted Sgt. Pepper as sort of the great all-time pop album? I don't know. I listen to Smile, and I hear nothing but brilliance, and I'm blown away by it musically. Every time I hear it, it's just staggering how amazing that is. Now, Brian did complete Smile in 2004. He actually toured behind it, and he released a recording of it. And then later on, he got with the record company, and they actually assembled the Smile tapes based on that completed version and released Smile to the public. Now, when I listen to the released Smile as it is, I do hear an incomplete album, and it's really sad to me because I kind of know, based on the 2004 version, what should have been in here, and knowing that it wasn't complete, it's frustrating. But I think this is where everything kind of crosses paths. Whereas the Beach Boys and the Beatles are following a parallel sort of in their career, in their early careers, then they get into this production race from Rubber Soul to Sgt. Pepper, where they're trying to outdo each other, where Brian's trying to outdo the Beatles, and the Beatles clearly won the race, as it were. Smile never comes out, and then that's where things really change. The Beach Boys, commercially, their career starts to really plummet. I don't think it ever really recovers. Now, I know they had a #1 hit in the 80s with Kokomo, but I think the Beach Boys essentially became, over the course of the 70s and 80s, an oldies act. The Beatles had the unique pleasure of breaking up in 1970, and so they kind of exist in this window of time from 62, 63 to 1970. That's it. The Beatles never really went into the 70s and 80s, and let's face it, make some dud albums. I think they would have, had they stayed together. I think we could look at the career of the Beatles and say, yeah, maybe that one wasn't as good or whatever. But because they're kind of in this one little area and they exist there, and their music was so brilliant, their released output was so brilliant, we can judge it by that standard. They weren't like the Beach Boys that continued, or the Rolling Stones that continued. And we know those bands made some pretty questionable albums. Now, there are some late period Beach Boys albums. I want to just throw out here really quickly Wild Honey, that came out in '67. It was a step back, particularly after the ambitiousness of Smile. Friends is another late period, late 60s album. I think it's worth hearing. Really nice stuff. Now, it's not maybe as ambitious or as out there as Smile or Sgt. Pepper or whatever the Beatles were doing at the time, but it's really nice stuff. But I think the Beach Boys did something in the 60s that really was the worst thing any band could do, and that is that they became passe, at least in the minds of the American public, the record buying public, that they became sort of this girls, cars, surfing, striped shirts, a cheesy sort of image, whereas in the late 60s, everything kind of went more flower power and hippie and more out there and mind-blowing. I go back to the Jimi Hendrix line on the album where he says, may I never hear surf music again. It's like he just kind of put a nail in the coffin. And so you had these smiling, good, wholesome guys singing these beautiful harmonies. Well, it was very much against, psychedelic music, or music that was turned on, as it were. And so I think that's where the Beach Boys really took this hard turn to the other side, and maybe, like I said, became an oldies act. So having said that, of course, the Beatles exist in their time. It's a brilliant sort of output, and it's staggering what they were able to accomplish in those short few years, really, versus a band that did continue on and continues on. Now, I know there's a lot of audiences and people that probably go see the Beach Boys and are very pleased with that, but they tend to stay away from the more out there and ambitious material that was going on. Of course, Brian Wilson has his following and people that love to go see Brian, and that's kind of more the melancholy, or the more introspective side, or the brilliant side, as it were. So what do you think? The Beatles versus the Beach Boys. I love both bands. The Beach Boys are really special to me. Their music got me through some really difficult times in my life. And so I feel really spiritually connected to a lot of that material, and particularly the stuff post Pet Sounds. Sunflower is just a beautiful, gorgeous album, and there's a lot of really good stuff throughout the '70s that I'm quite fond of. Stuff that just did not do anything as far as the record sales were concerned. And I know you can't judge art by record sales. I think art is judged by history. I think time has to pass, and so I recently did videos on the band Big Star, a band that commercially never was much of anything, but in time have grown in stature, and people that love them. And so I think there's people that definitely have grown to appreciate and love those Beach Boys albums that were pretty much ignored when they came out. Comment down below. I love interacting with you guys. I love hearing your thoughts. If you feel so inclined, please make a response video. I'd love to see what you have to say. Am I completely off my rocker, or way off base and everything that I'm saying here? If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so. And hit that little bell, get notified when there's new content that comes up. I try to stay on top of that. And like I said, if you comment, I do try to respond to the comments. Guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope you're all safe and well. Save the Texas Prairie Chicken. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.